This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners and viewers like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle, the Beirut Banyan. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And to stay updated with video releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. I'm Rani Shatar, and this is the Beirut Banyan. I'll start by saying that this is a real honor for me, and especially on a Friday when I'm sure you have better things to do. You're talking to me, so it really means a lot. And I'm in a way lucky because I've been following Newlines Magazine since their inception months back, and I read your articles regularly. I've had the good fortune of actually publishing as well, so I'm enjoying that outlet, and it's great to see your words there. And this most recent piece, Assad, the Shebaa Farms Are Syrian, whatever Hezbollah claims. And the byline is, the Syrian dictator dismissed Hezbollah's entire basis for being a Lebanese resistance, in quotes, in unsuccessful negotiations over a decade ago. I know because I was there. 21 years ago, my father's final months at the Lebanese embassy in Washington, D.C., the Syrian almost crisis and what to do now that the Israelis were leaving. Yeah. And those conversations were heated. And there was this almost that the Syrians were more afraid than anyone else vis-a-vis Hezbollah and vis-a-vis that legitimacy. Did you sense that there was any willingness back then? Or was there perhaps more willingness to have a distant relationship with Iran and at least in Lebanon, or whether it's been consistent the whole time? This has been almost a policy that hasn't changed much.
Sure. Yeah, my sense is that back in the 1999 era, the key difference between then and 10 years later, when I did my peace mediation, was that Hafiz al-Assad was in charge. Hafiz al-Assad was the senior member in the Syria-Iran partnership, and Hafiz al-Assad was the final authority on what Hezbollah would do or not do. And I think that changed. I think that changed over time. I think that that Bashar was more of a peer of Hassan Nasrallah, and had put Syria in more, I think, of a subordinate position toward Iran.
Right. So the shift comes really from Hafiz to Bashar.
I think so. I think that's the key thing, yeah.
Right. And back then, I know that this is Farouk Shara meeting with Ehud Barak and Camp David. There's at least talks of a potential deal.
Yes.
Is there any moment where there was any sort of that Hafiz could pull it off, meaning that Lebanon would be the next country to make peace if Hafiz al-Assad made peace with Israel? Or is that just not in the story back then, that the Syrians were just focused on Syria and Israel?
No, I think beginning in late 99 and on into perhaps the first month or two of 2000, there were very serious discussions facilitated by the United States, hosted by the United States at Shepherdstown in West Virginia. And I think those talks were serious, definitely at the working level. What we know now is that when the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak, arrived in Washington for those talks, he told Martin Indyk right at the outset, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't pull this off. I don't have the domestic support in Israel for a peace treaty with Syria that would entail a major territorial adjustment. Okay, so those talks were doomed from the beginning. But my sense was that the Syrian side really was quite interested in seeing whether or not a basis could be formed for formal peace. And when that went away, and Ehud Barak began speaking increasingly of an Israeli unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon,
Right.
this sent the Syrians into the dead panic that you noticed when you were in Washington, because now all of a sudden a serious piece of leverage they thought they had over Israel, namely their ability to control more or less the level of Hezbollah violence toward Israel. That this was going away, and what to do about that became a central fixation of Syrian policy at the time.
So am I reading it right that once the Israelis unilaterally withdrew, leaving Shebaa, Qajar, all this sort of other stuff that emerged from that withdrawal, that the Israeli withdrawal removed Syrian curiosity and at least distancing the Assad regime from Hezbollah, at least in Lebanon back then, that the Israelis may have gotten what they wanted, which is a withdrawal, but it at least made the Assad regime more reluctant to sever ties.
Yeah, I think the way I looked at it at the time certainly was that the Israeli unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon was seen by Syria as part of a broader pattern of Israel withdrawing its interest in an agreement with Syria. Therefore, any inclination Syria may have had at the time to rein in Hezbollah, to somehow limit its activities, would have gone away. And this, incidentally, was after the sort of last-ditch meeting between President Hafez al-Assad and President Clinton,
right,
in Geneva, and I believe that was in March 2000.
I think this is months before he passes away, if I'm not mistaken.
Just a few months. I believe President Assad passed away in June 2000.
Yes. Right.
But in any event, at that meeting in March, President Clinton found himself induced to present to the president of Syria a proposed territorial arrangement that departed significantly from what had been discussed at Shepherdstown and elsewhere. President Assad at that point said to President Clinton, obviously, Israel is not interested in peace, and basically walked away from it.
Was there ever a curiosity, at least on the American side, with having Lebanon? This is prior to 1559, prior to Hariri's assassination.
Right.
That Lebanon's sovereignty could reemerge once the Syrians severed ties with Hezbollah and Iran. Was it in that sort of window that Lebanon's sovereignty was sort of discussed, if it was discussed at all, or was it really just in plain terms a non-issue back then?
Ronnie, I'm not sure if it was a non-issue or not. I must say that in 1999, 2000, when all of this was going on, I was not a member of the United States government, so I was not privy to any inside conversations that may have taken place concerning Lebanon. My sense, knowing the participants who were involved in all of this, was that the focus was exclusively on Syria-Israel from the point of view of the United States. I think the guiding assumption was that Lebanon would somehow fall into place if an agreement could be reached between Israel and Syria. that Syria would oblige its Lebanese partner to put together a negotiating team and in due course reach an agreement with Israel. And I must say, I think this was undoubtedly the Lebanese position too.
Right.
The Lebanese position
Yes.
always was very consistent. We will never be first in reaching peace with Israel. It's possible we could reach it in coordination with Syria, simultaneously with Syria, or following Syria, but never in advance. So I think Lebanese governments have consistently, as long as there was a living, breathing peace process, Lebanese governments were consistently more than willing to sit in the back seat on all of this and await developments between Syria and Israel.
But I appreciate going back and remembering just how in charge the Syrians were when it comes to Lebanon. But I'll jump ahead to the piece now. And this is in 2011, 2010, 2011. And you know what I really appreciate about this piece? It's storytelling. This is really it's really your story, how you remember things. And you're taking me into those meetings with you. So I really enjoyed reading it. And I'll quote you here. Assad predicted that a Syria-Israel peace treaty would be followed by a Lebanon-Israel treaty, and that the losers, Iran and Hezbollah, would readily fall into line. I was simultaneously stunned and unconvinced. Still, Netanyahu would, days later, when briefed on the meeting, declare the mediation to be at a serious stage and authorize his team to take next steps. So in a way, you're the middleman. You're kind of trying to get... And
sure.
Yeah,
sure.
And Walid Ma'adam is in the background of the piece as well. Yet Netanyahu wants the real he wants to hear it from Assad. And I like that you're taking us there, sort of that where there's a climax to the story, that you're getting his words clear. Yeah. But 11 years later, at least when it comes to Lebanon, was there any potential for seeing Lebanon's sovereignty from 2005 until then, 2011, really take hold? Because I'm getting from the piece that even in those years, Lebanon's sovereignty is really not part of the story. And I'm coming back to Lebanon deliberately here because I'm trying to find any area where the Americans were actually at least curious about what Lebanon would look like or could look like once that relationship would change. And I don't know. And I'd really like to hear what your memories of the conversations back then. Was it still really the Syrians have more leverage and we have to talk to the Syrians too when talking about Lebanon? And I include all the 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9 governments in Lebanon, that March 14 coalition that came and went. Was it still really Damascus has the final say? And therefore, you have to talk to them when talking about Lebanon.
Well, Ronnie, I came into government for the second time in my professional life in early 2009 and took over the not only Syria-Israel peace process matters, but also Lebanon-Israel. Okay, and in this sense, the Obama administration, I think, correctly elevated Lebanon a bit. There was no idea in our minds of trying to encourage Lebanon to get out in front of Syria on peace process matters. This was just considered impossible. Syrian influence in Lebanon, even though the occupation, so to speak, had been ended years before after the assassination of former Prime Minister Hariri, still Syria's influence in Lebanon through Hezbollah, through other means, was very, very, very strong. Nevertheless, I spent a lot of quality time in Beirut with your late dad and others, trying to mediate a maritime agreement between Lebanon and Israel, something that was done without reference at all.
We still call your last name as if your last name is Line, and it's the so your name, whenever it comes up, Line is attached to it.
Well, it was a fascinating experience, but the point I'm trying to make is that we tried our best to treat Lebanon as a party that had its own independent concerns and its own dignity, and I think we succeeded. But at the same time, there was no illusion that when it came to a prospective peace with Israel, that Lebanon was still going to be in that proverbial backseat. That Syria-Israel coming to agreement was the necessary precondition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that precondition had been met, and if things worked out in accordance with what President Bashar al-Assad told me, then there would have been, I think, a really positive enhancement of Lebanon's sovereignty as a result of a peace agreement with Israel, because by definition, the so-called resistance would have been terminated. The rationale for a large independent militia to remain armed would have disappeared. Lebanon would have entered into a regular relationship with its neighbor to the south. There perhaps would have been provisions concerning Palestinian refugees residing in Lebanon and what would happen to them. There would be adjustments along the blue line,
right.
And there would have been a maritime agreement. There would have been finally an official boundary on land and at sea between Lebanon and Israel. I think this would have been all to the good for Lebanon, and it is one of the primary sources of my disappointment that this peace mediation between Syria and Israel did not in the end succeed. Is that Lebanon obviously did not become a beneficiary of these efforts.
What strikes me in the piece is the certainty Assad speaks with, that he is willing to go all the way when it comes to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I found that
Hezbollah, and on the one hand, when he told me, when he said, Mr. Hoff, this land is Syrian. This land is Syrian.
Right.
When we have recovered our land, then we can have talks with the Lebanese about adjustments here and there, about private ownership of certain plots of land and all that. But this land is Syrian. His statement of fact didn't surprise me at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think anybody who has studied this issue, starting with the United Nations, comes to the conclusion that this area in question, the Shebaa Farms and associated areas, was definitely under Syrian sovereignty. What surprised me was his readiness and absolute lack of hesitation, whether he was conscious of it or not, that he was undermining the entire rationale for Hezbollah's armed status. That I found surprising.
Exactly. And, I'll take liberty here. I'll quote you to you again. And this is sort of later in the piece. Among other things, Al-Assad assured me that Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah would liquidate his organization's resistance, in quotes, and fall into line with the provisions of a Lebanon-Israel Treaty of Peace, an accord that would, in Al-Assad's view, automatically follow the signing of a Syria-Israel treaty. I asked al-Assad if Nasrallah renouncing resistance, quote, would first require that Syria formally transfer the Shebaa Farms and associated territory to Lebanon. His answer was an unambiguous no, it would not. Is it just that he's trying to gain something from this conversation with you? Because it sounds like a completely different Assad, that he's saying something like you just said it, he's willing to go all the way. And that to me would be a red line for Hezbollah and Iran, that he's almost political suicide. And I use the word political sort of carefully here, that this is survivability at home, and he's in a way willing to take risks. Is this just a matter of bluffing, that he's telling you something that he doesn't mean?
Well, Ronnie, I literally did not have then, and I do not have now, the ability to read the mind
sure, of
Bashar al-Assad. What I can report accurately is what he said, and the very direct and unambiguous manner in which he put things. Now, I was surprised by his undermining of the resistance rationale. But to be honest with you, I went away from that meeting thinking, this is extraordinarily interesting. I mean, suspicions confirmed about the whole Shebaa Farms episode, but it's also a bit troubling. Because does the president of Syria truly believe that Iran and Hezbollah would take all of this lying down?
Right.
That they would say, oh dear, you're getting your real estate back. Well, mabruk. In that case, let us stand down. Let us disarm. We Iranians, no longer need an arm of the Islamic Revolution inside Lebanon, and we, Hezbollah, we are prepared to disarm once Lebanon arrives at a peace treaty with Israel, and simply function as a normal political party. I had doubts about that proposition, and frankly, I would have felt better. I would have felt better if President Assad had said to me, look, the Iranians, Hezbollah, they're going to have real problems with what I'm doing here. Right. But I'm doing this for the interests of Syria, and if forced, I will fight to uphold the interests of Syria. I would have felt better if he had said something like that, instead of giving me, what I feared was a sort of blue sky assessment of how everything would fall into place once Syria and Israel came to closure.
It almost discounts Iran's interests in Lebanon, sort of speaking on behalf of something that's beyond him as well. So that's what struck me as very odd, that he'd be willing to say that in blunt words, that he's willing to go all the way. And it's months before the protests begin in Syria.
It's it's only weeks. Ronnie. It's only about 3 weeks later that the unarmed peaceful protests begin, and protesters are finding themselves subjected to lethal, deadly fire by Syrian security forces. Yeah, it was roughly 3 weeks after my discussion with President Assad.
As much as you'd like to say about this topic, was there any follow-up discussion on this issue once the protests began, or was it just it was off the table at that point?
Right after the meeting, about 2 days later, I had a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his team in Jerusalem, and we discussed it at length. My conversation with President Assad, Netanyahu, as I mentioned in the article, characterized the mediation as very serious, and he authorized his team to make next steps. Our hope on the American side, now bear in mind, up till this point, this had all been shuttle diplomacy. This was basically me traveling back and forth between Damascus and Jerusalem. Our hope on the American side was that perhaps in April or May of 2011, we could bring Syrian and Israeli teams together, perhaps in an Eastern European location, where they could finalize the text of a treaty of peace that was already going back and forth between them in the form of an American draft. But once the shooting began in Syria, things came to a screeching halt.
Right.
Those of us who had been involved in this effort were, of course, hoping that what had happened initially in Deraa and in Damascus would be one-time incidents, that the president of the Syrian Arab Republic would exercise peaceful and diplomatic means to try to address the concerns of his citizens with police brutality, with illegal detention, and all the rest, and then get things back on track. I will regret to my last day on this planet that never happened. It never happened. The Syrian government, for whatever reason, doubled down on this strategy of responding to peaceful protest with lethality. And a decade later, look at Syria and see the results.
This story, unfortunately, is Lebanon's story as well, and that the regime in Damascus has been either directly or indirectly involved in Lebanese affairs for over 4 decades at least. There's a heavy involvement even as their army withdraws. And by 2011, 2012, it's a very strange situation where Lebanese are looking up at the sky and wondering if the Americans are going to be hitting Syria after the chemical weapons attack and the Red Line and that the very sensitive months and that happened. Lebanese are looking up and wondering what's going to happen. So it's felt here. And like you said, 10 years later, Syria has been destroyed. That regime is there. It's still technically in charge of whatever is left of what they're in charge of.
It's not doing much in the way of governing, but it's still in its seat, basically.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, Lebanon has gone through hell as well.
Yes.
And I know that you're not. I know that you're not in government. I know that you're an academic, Bard College, and I'm going to ask you as much as you'd like to say. I'll say this as someone who's really curious about how you see recent events in Lebanon vis-a-vis U.S. policy. And the reason I'm going there specific is it's been almost a year and a half now that there's been a protest movement that demanded many things that I think are in sync with what the Americans would want to see in Lebanon. Basic things like reform, accountability, anti-corruption slogans. I think that genuinely resonates. Let alone chants for the first time against Hezbollah's leverage in the country, which is an unusual occurrence. And it could just be chants. It could just be frustration that's being vented without much happening on the ground. But nonetheless, there is a marked shift in attitude, at least, when it comes to Lebanon's discussions on Hezbollah. And it reminds me of that opening that Lebanese could talk about the Assad regime in 2004, 5, and 6. Lebanese are more willing to talk about Hezbollah today. But the threat is there. And I think in the background, there is a willingness in some corners in Lebanon to talk about sovereignty once more. maybe coming from odd locations. It's the patriarch talks about neutrality. Certain political figures may sort of regurgitate that as well at times, but the conversation is there. And now we have something that's unusual, a return to Europe. Jawad Zarif, I think it's Rob Malley and his team, the Americans and the Iranians are speaking once more about that relationship. And the reason I'm going very big right now is I'm curious, at least in that big dance, is Lebanon a remote concern today? And I ask it really in basics, that is Lebanon's sovereignty really just not an issue? That in those conversations, in any discussion with a country that has heavy influence in Lebanon, like Iran, does Lebanon come up? Or do you think it comes up? Or is there any moment where sovereignty in this country is even brought up, at least in terms of trying to shield Lebanon from what's happening? Or is it just not there altogether? And I don't know anyone better to ask this question than you, because you had one foot in one, and you have now both feet out.
Both feet out, yes.
Yeah, and you're familiar with this terrain. You're intimate with it. Whether or not this is just a fait accompli, when it comes to American interests, at least in seeing Lebanon in the years to come, knowing that there's also a real, genuine appetite for moving on in this country, yet it doesn't happen. And it seems to not happen largely because of those broader problems, less to do with local concerns. So anything you'd like to say?
Ronnie, it's a tough question for me to answer, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I do have both feet very much outside of government now. I am a professor, believe it or not, at Bard College in upstate New York. I also have to make an effort when speaking about Lebanon and American policy to separate wishful thinking on my part from what can objectively be observed about the deliberations of the new Biden administration.
Yes,
I mean, I certainly hope, as someone who loves Lebanon, as someone who is more than appreciative of the minimum 150-year legacy of Lebanese immigrants to the United States, enriching my country in countless ways. All right, these are things that make me hope fervently that the Biden administration will take a careful look at Lebanon and try to do some things that will help. Okay, I think certainly Lebanon now, among other things, is going through a monumental humanitarian crisis. I think the United States can help with this. The Lebanese armed forces, with which the United States has had a very positive relationship for decades now, is in a position where it's finding difficulty paying the troops, getting the fuel, keeping up stocks of ammunition. This is something. This is something the United States can address. Now, I am told that these things are under discussion in the Departments of State, Defense, and elsewhere. I do not know if the U.S. is on the verge of a decision with any of these things. I certainly hope so. President Biden has been very clear in terms of what his priorities are, both in domestic and foreign affairs. All right, the Middle East per se does not rate very high in those priorities, and I think there's much to be admired in a public figure who really exercises discipline in addressing his or her priorities. But on the other hand, I think it's also easy to see where places like Lebanon and Syria are connected to those priorities,
Right.
connected to the restoration of American leadership in the world. Okay. And I think, the administration is only a couple of months old. It is certainly entitled to an intensive and somewhat extended policy review before it goes into action in various corners of the world. But I certainly hope, and if I actually had to bet on it, I would say that certainly before long, you're going to see the United States doing some positive things to help the people of Lebanon.
Without taking too much more of your time, I know you've been generous. You've given me a little more than we agreed to, so I appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Just a curiosity, more curiosity than anything. Post March 14, 2005, there seemed to be a very, very active American, at least Jeffrey Feltman as the ambassador in Lebanon,
Sure.
seemed to have more direct involvement, at least in terms of trying to gauge what was happening on the ground, and that there were people willing to speak. And these were primarily from the usual political class in Lebanon. Today, it's a very different attitude towards these leaders. I think the population is largely fed up. But 15, 16 years ago, it simply wasn't the case. And you could have that kind of communication, a back and forth exchange. Today, I'm guessing, and you tell me if you see it the same way, I'm guessing that the reason why there's no apparent dialogue is that this has largely remained a leaderless movement in Lebanon, that you don't have sort of the kind of leadership that maybe a country would want to have when it comes to discussing policy. And am I getting that right? That's part of the perhaps why we don't see and we don't hear much when it comes to this protest movement and American engagement compared to the March 14 protests and the months thereafter, and the very, very concerned and very active American engagement.
Well, Ronnie, there may be something to that, and I would certainly yield to Ambassador Shea, who clearly has the job of interacting on a daily basis with Lebanese political leaders. But I think there is among people in the United States, especially in government, whether it's in the executive branch or in the Congress, those who have taken the time over the years to familiarize themselves to a degree with Lebanon and with the way it is governed and all the rest, have generally come to the conclusion that the Lebanese political class per se is incapable of reform, simply incapable of reform. And this goes directly to your question of, okay, at this point, who do you really connect with?
Right.
Who could make a difference? Who is truly on the receiving end of anything the United States tries to do in a positive manner in all of this? So I would hope, for example, in the Agency for International Development, just as an example, there are ways being examined to reach out directly to Lebanese NGOs, to young Lebanese who are trying their best to change this system from the bottom up. Okay, there may be more traditional ways to address the problems of the Lebanese armed forces, for sure. But in terms of how the United States assists and who is on the receiving end of that assistance, I do think, and I regret to say this, that the government of Lebanon per se presents a real challenge, a real problem to anybody who wants to help.
We've exchanged emails. Lucky I met you once in Washington, D.C., maybe now 7 or 8 years ago.
It's been a while, yes.
We had a nice exchange in your office at the Atlantic Council. And I know that, well, I've heard it in different Zoom exchanges and webinars that you've shared some stories about your friendship with my father, a professional friendship, more sort of at least a geopolitical friendship, perhaps. But there's something there. I've never really had the chance to ask you this. If you could share maybe a memory that resonates today, or even an anecdote. It makes me so happy when you reference the Alaskan model that he was speaking of in terms of oil and gas reserves that sort of give it back to the population, don't put it in the hands of the political elite. That kind of story, it resonates with me because I remember him trying to think about these things. If there's anything you can share about an interaction with him or anything when it comes to my father.
Yeah, Ronnie, the one thing that always impressed me about your dad, whether he was serving as ambassador in Washington or later as a senior advisor to Prime Minister Saad Hariri at the time, was his sense of humor. This was a genuinely funny man. Who just absolutely refused to take himself seriously, and the contrast between that and what you typically find at the upper levels of Lebanese policymakers and parliamentarians and so forth was stunning. Your dad was my principal interlocutor on the Lebanese side when I began the maritime mediation between Lebanon and Israel. Mr. Hariri was still the prime minister, and he designated your dad as my principal point of contact for this. And I do remember our first conversation where he was a tough negotiator. He was not the least bit hesitant about putting Lebanon's position right out there on the table very explicitly. But we did get into a discussion of, okay, if all of this works, if we can come up with a mutually agreed maritime separation line, if Lebanon can launch, licensing procedures, exploration, and actually begin to receive revenue from natural gas exploitation. I said, Mohammed, what in your view would this mean for Lebanon? And he said, aha. He said, this is the question. He said, I have been studying the system used in the state of Alaska in the United States, whereby revenues from oil, and we're talking big money here, revenues from oil go to the residents of Alaska in the form of personal checks from the state of Alaska. And he said, Fred, my sense is that, if we're going to avoid the spectacle of all of this money somehow disappearing, this is the way we're going to have to do it. And I will never forget that. And God bless his soul. I wish he were still with us, because very, very hard to find anybody better than Hamid Shatta to represent the interests of Lebanon.
That means a lot. I really appreciate that, and I'm glad you mentioned his humor. Was a very.
This is a funny man.
Yes, sometimes even unintentionally hilarious, And
I remember once in Washington meeting with him at either at his residence or in the embassy. I guess it was in his residence. And at the time, scientific studies had been issued to the effect that margarine, which
Yes.
people had been using for years as a supposedly healthy substitute for butter, margarine was suddenly found to have, numerous bad side effects. And your dad was absolutely outraged about this. He said, "God damn it! I've been eating this stuff. I've been suffering from this stuff for years and years and years, and now they tell me it's poisoning me." And he went on and on. And he had us. There were a small handful of us, and we were all practically on the floor with laughter. I mean,
That's funny.
He was a stunningly humorous person.
It means a lot. Thank you for sharing these things. I always like to hear about him through people like yourself, just in general, stories about him that I don't always know. And I know him spreading his margarine with pain, and now I know why. Because too late. He found out way too late.
No, he was a man with an extraordinarily he was tough, but he also had an extraordinarily sweet disposition. When I say he was a man of great humor, the humor just infused his character. This was not just a matter of being able to tell a joke, with good timing and a nice punchline. He was a very sweet human being, and he's greatly missed.
He cared so much about this country, and it's infectious. That kind of passion for Lebanon, and he really believed in reestablishing Lebanon's sovereignty.
Yes,
I think that's the dream unfulfilled. That's the post-war Lebanese experience that should have taken hold, and it didn't.
I agree.
Ambassador Hoff, I really appreciate your time tonight, and hope we can do this again at a later point.
Ronnie, it's been a pleasure to see your face, hear your voice, and I do look forward to seeing you again before long.
Thanks. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening and watching. And a friendly reminder to support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.